Hi, welcome back to the Quillette Etc. podcast. I'm Zoe Booth, and today I'll be speaking with Claire Lehrmann, the founder of Quillette, and we're going to be talking about the latest in the Brittany Higgins scandal in Australia and a number of other issues relating to sexual dynamics and culture. Hey, Claire.
Hi, Zoe. How are you going?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Massive news from this week regarding the Brittany Higgins rape allegations. It's not looking very favourable for Brittany Higgins, right?
Yeah, well, a lot of our listeners and readers will not be familiar with this case because it's specific to Australia. What happened was a couple of years ago, during the Me Too movement, a young woman alleged that she was sexually assaulted inside Australia's Parliament House. Mm-hmm. And at the time, this was used as a weapon against the then government, which was led by Scott Morrison. And her name was brought up hundreds of times during question time. So opposition MPs were asking the government, what did you know about this allegation? How did you help this girl? Did you take it to the police? What did you know? All of these questions were being asked of the government, and it was used to embarrass them and to sort of construct this narrative that the Liberal Party, which is our centre-right party, have a problem with women. Now, whatever you think about the Liberal Party's problem with women, that putting that to one side, the allegation was never proved. And but the thing is, once the allegation was made, the police had to get involved because rape, sexual assault, is a major crime, and you cannot raise such issues publicly without the police getting involved. So the police did get involved, the ACT police, and then the Director of Public Prosecutions in the ACT took it all the way to court. Now, there was a mistrial because of juror misconduct. The man who has had the allegation made against him has never, he doesn't have a guilty verdict, but he doesn't have a not guilty verdict. And since the trial, there's been an inquiry into the actions of the DPP and the AFP, and all of this new information has come out about the police not wanting to press charges due to lack of evidence. Now, the most recent stories coming out in The Australian document how this young woman and her partner were involved with Labor operatives and were seeking to get Labor ministers on side before the allegations were even made public. So it's a huge scandal for the government. But more broadly, it's an example of how personal or criminal matters are used in politics. And it's sort of an ugly example of how something very serious such as sexual assault can be used as a political weapon. And this scandal has just erupted now for this particular government, the Labor government, and I imagine that it's going to keep going and keep going and keep going, and it's going to be it's kind of ironic because the original allegation was meant to embarrass the former government, and it did, but it's now embarrassing the current government.
It's backfiring.
Yeah.
And we don't know what happened that night. We're not denying that, Brittany Higgins possibly was raped, but it's definitely looking bad for her now because those texts have been shown, texts between her and David Shiraz, her now boyfriend.
Well, there was a conspiracy. I mean, that's an ugly term, but they were conspiring to get politicians to publicise her allegation in Parliament. And so if you're getting political figures and media figures, if you're plotting with them behind the scenes for your own ends, that is a conspiracy.
Yeah, and on top of that, the text messages show that they're reveling in the fact that they're now famous.
Yeah, it's a bit. So the funny thing is that when her allegation came out, there was all of this media commentary about the culture in Parliament in Canberra, the culture, as if it's some kind of hotbed of sexism. I used to live in Canberra. I wasn't involved in politics, but I was a federal bureaucrat. I mean, yeah, maybe there's some hard drinking. People work hard and they go out drinking at night, sure. But the culture is of people plotting and scheming and imagining that they're political players and that they're power brokers. That's the culture. And this whole episode reflects that to a T. I mean, it's not a culture of systematic misogyny. It's a culture of people imagining themselves and wanting to have power, imagining themselves as power players and then working to gain that power for their own agendas.
And what this story goes to show is that you can gain power through riding this Me Too movement. You know, Canberra is the place of power and you can get power in many ways. And Brittany Higgins has obviously got some power through claiming, whether it's right or wrong, that she is a victim. And now we can see, I mean, I was looking at her LinkedIn before and she's got a career paved for her now. This might affect it. But, you know, roles at ANU is like diversity and, you know, women's advisor. She's become the face of, you know, fighting misogyny in Australia.
Yeah, it's definitely... You can jump on bandwagons, activist bandwagons, and have a pretty fruitful career if you know the right people and have some leverage in media. I think this will not be good. It's very embarrassing for anybody involved, and it's, you know, it's not going to bode well for the people involved, any of the people involved, including
for women, right? Women in general.
And that's an important point. Look, I mean, at the height of the Me Too movement, there was a phrase that was used quite often, which was believe women or believe all women. Do you remember what it was?
Believe both of them, I think. Believe women, believe all women.
And it's actually a really bad slogan to popularize. You know, we want to be able to support victims of crime, of course, but this idea that everyone with an allegation should immediately be believed is completely, it's medieval. I mean, we've moved. Like I spent summer reading books about witch trials, people getting burned at the stake for witchcraft in early modern Europe. And what happened in those days was that if you were accused of witchcraft, you had no recourse. If your neighbour didn't like you and accused you of witchcraft, you could be burnt at the stake within days. And we've progressed a long way since that time. And part of why we have progressed as a society, as a civilization, is because we have the presumption of innocence. And this slogan, believe all women, is a complete repudiation of the presumption of innocence, which is a bedrock of our society, and it works for women as well. Women are accused of crimes. Women are accused of major crimes, and they deserve the presumption of innocence as well. This is why we have the court system. This is why we rely on hard evidence, physical evidence, not just witness testimony. I mean, this is so basic to how our society operates that I find it quite aggravating that, you know, these attacks on the rule of law and due process come from people who claim to represent women. Because if you wind back due process, if you wind back the presumption of innocence, women are harmed as well as men.
Yeah.
these legal protections protect all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're lucky to live in a country that does have a good rule of law, or usually has good rule of law, and we have trust in our institutions. And actually, Australians in general trust politicians more than in other countries. So things like this, stories breaking like this could really shake up people's trust in the Labor Party, which so far I think the new Labor Party, the new government has been quite popular, but this risks changing
this is definitely the first political scandal that they're dealing with, and it's a major one, and it's likely to play out for months. But you're right, Australia does have high trust in institutions, and I don't think this will damage it too much because it will be investigated. We know it will be investigated. We know it will be investigated by journalists, and the payout that Higgins received is likely to go to a new anti-corruption body set up in the ACT. So that will be thoroughly investigated. Bruce Lehrmann has a defamation trial that's on right now, and the court system will take care of it. And, and whatever the outcome is, I imagine it will be a fair and transparent one. But I don't think this scandal will undermine trust so much because we just have good mechanisms for investigating. We have really good mechanisms for investigating corruption.
Do you think this is the end of the Me Too movement in Australia? It's like the nail in the coffin, do you think?
Yeah, I do, because it's not the only case that has backfired. So allegations against Jeffrey Rush backfired. True. He received a defamation payout against the Daily Telegraph, I believe it was. There have been other cases of people suing for defamation. So our country has quite strict defamation laws, and it has meant that spurious allegations or allegations that cannot be proven have not gotten any traction. And I actually think that's a good thing.
Good. Okay, and what about the culture of young women working with young men, and they were both young people working in Canberra. Yeah. We know that lots of couples meet in the workplace.
Yeah.
There's work parties. I think Christmas parties are one of the most common places for sexual assaults to happen.
Right. Yeah.
So what do you think? Do you think there needs to be some improvement in terms of like the culture of working in Australia?
It's a tricky question, to be honest. I haven't. There's a lot of statistics and activist claims around sexual assault that I'm not sure are entirely reliable. So as far as I know, from the last time I looked at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, what we would consider serious sexual assault, so sexual intercourse without consent, happens most often to teenage girls, and the offender is most often someone they know, and it's often a family member, an extended family member, or some other trusted person that they know, so a teacher, tutor, an uncle, stuff like that. I'm not sure it happens a lot for adult women. Maybe it does. But I think there needs to be more focus on protecting children from sexual assault, because the statistics of people who are victimized for sexual assault, there's many, many, many more children and teenagers getting victimized than there are adults. And that's for both men and women. Yeah. Young boys have a higher risk of being sexually assaulted than women in their 40s.
Yeah.
So my son is at higher risk than I am. But we don't talk about that.
No.
We just don't talk about it. But
Most
that's
people
what the
wouldn't know that.
that's what the statistics show. So we really need to be protecting our young people.
Definitely.
You know, I've said before that rape is actually a crime against young people. It's not a crime against women, because young boys and teenage boys are victims too. And so we really should be moving away from this notion that it's a crime of a gendered crime where men
Sexism.
are trying to oppress women, and it's motivated by power. It's not motivated by power. It's motivated by sex, and it's a crime against young people.
And we recently published a very interesting article by Naomi Schaefer-Riley on that topic, about how Ron DeSantis in Florida, the governor of Florida, would like to introduce laws to execute child abusers.
Sex offenders, yeah.
And her argument, which I found really interesting and very persuasive, was that if children are already reluctant to testify against adults because, as you were saying, most of the time they know the adults. So this would make them even more hesitant.
Yeah, that's
if they knew that, you know, their uncle or stepdad or whoever it is could be executed.
Yeah.
It would make them reluctant.
That's right. And one of the most sad statistics when it comes to the child abuse is the statistic showing that children who live with adults who are not related to them are 10 times more likely to be abused than children who live with their biological parents. And Jonathan Haidt has said in a talk years ago that the most dangerous person in a child's life is mum's boyfriend.
Very scary. And I don't think many people know that, because, as you were saying, we think of sexual assault often as a gendered thing, and then we've got this idea of stranger danger, that, you know, people who get raped are women who are jogging in the park late at night. And
so both political sides have their own narrative about sexual assault. So the left has this narrative that it's a tool of oppression by the patriarchy, and that rape is motivated by power, which is wrong. And the right has a narrative that children are at risk of stranger danger. So they're at risk of, you know, there's child, you know, there's this cabal of elites who are kidnapping and trafficking kids, you know, the whole QAnon thing, which is stupid. Both are wrong. Kids are more likely to be abused by people they know, so people in their family. And then the feminist narrative is also wrong. It's rape is motivated by sex, and it's not necessarily. And the reason I say that is because, look, if it was really about power, wouldn't older women be targeted more than 15-year-old girls? Whereas, you know, the most dangerous time for a woman to be targeted is when she's a teenage girl, when she has no power. And that's why I think it's not really about power at all.
And what do you tell your kids, or how would you educate your children? I mean, your girl's not quite a teenager yet, but in a few years she will be. And
that's a good question, actually, because you know, my kids are too young. But what I would do if I was in charge of advising kids, young people, particularly girls, is I would tell them that firstly, if something happens to them that they don't consent to, they should go to the hospital straight away, because we live in a society where if you want to convict, you need evidence, and you need to collect evidence immediately. Secondly, there are some red flags you can pick up on. You know, we know that sex offenders are like other criminal offenders in that they're high in dark triad traits, so psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism, and you can pick up on red flags. And you know, another myth about offenders is that their sex offenders are incels, right? They're sex-starved incels. But some of the empirical data shows that some men who commit these acts are not incels at all, and they're quite used to women actually consenting. And when a woman doesn't consent, they just sort of dismiss it and they just railroad over her. So, you have to watch out for the narcissists and the men who are not going to take no for an answer. And there are certain red flags you can be attuned to.
And coming back to the Brittany Higgins case, she had been drinking the night of the alleged incident, and she argued that she could barely walk, but CCTV footage has come out to show that she could walk. I'm not denying that she was drinking, though. It was a party. Now, Camille Paglia would say that, if you go back to a guy's room and you've been drinking, you should be conscious of that, and that you're taking a risk in doing that, and you should take responsibility for that risky situation that you're putting yourself in. Traditional feminists would say that's
victim blaming.
What do you think about that, about women putting themselves in situations where they're more at risk? And
that's a tricky one.
Spicy topic.
Because nothing excuses rape, nothing excuses sexual assault. And I don't care how drunk someone is, or how they're dressed, or how much they've led someone on. There's no excuse for it. At the same time, I don't think it's unreasonable to be alert to your environment. I mean, I'm a woman, you're a woman. We're alert to our environment when we cross the road.
Exactly.
Like, I'm not going to walk in front of a car and expect nothing to happen to me. And I do think just to share my own experience, I've been in lots of situations with men where I would have been vulnerable, like I've been drunk and alone and sleeping in their bed, and I've never been, taken advantage of, and that's because I trusted the men I was with, and they were good men or boys at the time, I don't want to make the point that we shouldn't have high expectations of male behaviour. I think we should definitely have high expectations. At the same time, I think, every person has a responsibility to look after themselves.
Definitely.
And I would just say, I just wish more feminists would tell young women to go to the bloody police if something happens. Just go. File the report, go to the hospital, get the evidence. Just do it. Don't sit on it for a few days thinking about it. You don't have to continue with it if you don't want to, but just get the evidence collected. That's what I would say.
And part of the issue is probably that so many people, for example, feminists like Clementine Ford, for example, that, ilk, say that police don't care, that they never believe women.
Irresponsible. It's terribly irresponsible to tell people that police aren't going to do a good job or the court system is not going to do a good job. Yes, it's hard to prove crime, and there's good reasons for that, because we don't want to send innocent people to jail. But that doesn't mean they're not going to do a good job, and they don't care. They very much care.
Yeah, we've got one of the best, police forces and rules of law in the world, right? It doesn't get much better than here. Not to say that they don't mess up sometimes, but I've got trust in the police, and if I were to, be assaulted, I would go straight there and wouldn't question my treatment.
It's all about evidence. I mean, they do what they can. They do what they can with the evidence available, and the way they can collect evidence is by going and reporting as soon as a crime has been committed, basically. If you're going to leave it for weeks, months, years, I mean, they'll do what they can, but there's not much that can be done if there's no evidence.
Yeah, so if I had a daughter, hopefully one day I do, I would definitely try to educate her on both things, right? That there's personal responsibility.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be bad actors out there, those
That's right.
dark triad personality types,
Yeah.
predators.
Yeah.
You've always got to be aware of that. But also that, you know, men do have responsibility over their actions as well.
Yeah.
So, and if I have a boy, I will obviously educate him to be a gentleman and
chivalrous.
yes, chivalry is not dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard time to be a young guy though, because, you know, we know from the statistics that young people are having less and less sex, I believe, and getting into relationships later and losing their virginity later.
That's true.
Maybe COVID had something to do with that, or being online, spending so much time interacting on social media and not in person.
Yeah. You have to be in person to have sex.
Yes. Well, some of these Zoomers are doing some pretty creative things, I've heard. But yeah, it's really hard for guys to approach women today, I think. You know, it depends. A lot depends on sort of the social class that you're operating into. I think in more working class areas, it's still fine to like go up to a woman and, you know, approach her in the pub or wherever. But among more like educated professional women, that can be, you can be risking a lot by going up to those women.
I think it differs quite remarkably according to local culture. So where I grew up in Adelaide, I think there was perhaps an uneven sex ratio. I think there were maybe more girls than boys.
Okay.
And that meant that we had to pursue men.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And I used to and there were these narratives about, women being the victims of all of this sexual harassment. And I was like, where? What? No one's sexually harassing us.
There aren't enough men.
We had to pursue men. And, I used to think to myself more, I've spilled more tears over not getting phoned back or called by a guy than I have by, being like hit on by someone who I didn't want to hit on me. Like, I'm seriously like there was a lack of malattention, not too much. But that was one particular city at a particular time. And it may have changed, and I don't want to generalize from that milieu, the social milieu that I was in, to other social milieus. I'm sure that in many other environments it's completely different, and males behave in a boorish manner towards women. Like, I don't doubt that for a second. But things like sex ratios do make a difference. And so you'll find on university campuses now that there are more girls than boys. And in professional contexts, like the balance of how many men and women there are does sort of change the dynamic. I mean, I'm sort of old now, so I don't really know what it's like out there. And I don't really...
We live in our own little bubble here at Quillette.
You've talked to me about how it's hard for young men. I don't know enough young men to be able to say. I just don't. Maybe you can share some of your observations.
Yeah. That's just going off what I've seen, at bars and clubs, but also online. Yeah. So it's so easy now to screenshot texts. Yeah. So with so many people on dating apps, a guy can, make a faux pas, say something that's, a bit off or just awkward. A lot of guys are really, really awkward. Yeah. And I think women underestimate how nervous guys get when they talk to girls online or in person, especially in person. Yeah. And like when I was in Melbourne, I overheard a girl at a cafe talking about a guy who mansplained winter to her. she was talking to a girlfriend. Oh, this guy said that now that it's winter, I may be feeling cold. How ridiculous, how much, how disrespectful that he mansplained such a stupid thing to me. And in my head, I was thinking the guy was either really old or possibly a bit autistic or just very awkward.
And nervous.
Yeah, and was like, oh, I want to talk to this girl. What do I talk to her about? Oh, winter. I think that's endearing as long as men are respectful and don't intrude your personal space too much and listen to you when you say, hey, I'm chatting to my girlfriend tonight, really not keen to talk to you, or I don't say that. But as long as they pick up social cues and are respectful.
Yeah, it's a real failure of theory of mind or empathy, isn't it, to assume that someone's being condescending to you when they're really just quite awkward. I don't know why that is the case. Maybe so Camille Paglia describes herself as being she's called herself transgender, right?
Yeah.
And she is in a same-sex relationship, and so she purports to understand male sexuality, which gives her some insight into the male-female dynamics. And I think that's really interesting and probably correct. If you have no curiosity or insight into how powerful male sexuality is, then of course you're not going to be of course you're going to misread communication signals from men, and maybe you're going to interpret awkwardness in a more sinister or negative manner. But if you have a bit more understanding, as in you understand how powerful that really is, then you're going to have compassion.
Exactly.
Because the way I view male sexuality is that it's a curse. I don't want to be particularly afflicted with, 10 times the amount of testosterone than what I have and be having intrusive thoughts in my day-to-day life.
Yeah, it's overbearing, especially when men are young. Yeah.
I mean, who wants that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I think compassion is probably a better response initially. Obviously, if someone's being patronising and condescending, obviously you can sort of update. But I think compassion is not a bad place to start.
No, I'd love to see a lot more compassion between the sexes, especially coming from women to men. I think it's very unpopular to show any sort of compassion for men, as we can see in this Brittany Higgins case. People are so quick to assume the worst of men and have no compassion when bad things happen to them. And yeah, I think it's not a nice culture to be in, when there's such distrust between the sexes.
Yeah. It's I think you're right, but you know what? It's probably not that bad to be a young man at the moment if you have a bit of sort of drive and confidence, because, I actually think victimhood culture is worse for women because it encourages women to perceive themselves as victims, and as soon as you perceive yourself as a victim, you're less likely to sort of take risks and see yourself succeeding and taking opportunities and pushing yourself further. And so because men are not seen as victims, maybe that's going to create an environment where they actually succeed, because you need to be resilient and tough to succeed. And so we've sort of set up this environment where women are perceiving themselves as fragile victims and men have to suck it up and toughen up, and that's just exactly what's going to happen. So
that's
my prediction is that you'll see more male entrepreneurs, fewer female entrepreneurs. Not that entrepreneurship is everything, but it's one proxy for risk taking, because they have to be tougher in this environment, in this cultural environment. And so we're sort of putting pressure on men because we're not sympathizing them and empathizing with them. That's going to drive them to be more successful.
Interesting. I've never thought of that before.
It's a prediction. I could be wrong.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll watch this in a decade's time and see what happens. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about today?
No, Zoe. Thanks for the chat as always. And I look forward to chatting very soon.
Yeah. Speak to you next week.
Cool.